Morning, everybody. Have a seat, please.
Maybe we space them a bit
Yeah,
more.
it's a little bit intimate, isn't it? I'm not sure how we follow an AI-driven poem. That's quite an introduction. So we first met at this event, the first event, 3-4 years ago. The kind of before that COVID.
Pre-pandemic.
Pre-pandemic, yeah. And you were with Ipsen at the time, and you've been with big pharma before that, mid-sized pharma. Now you're with a biotech. And anybody that doesn't know GlycoMimetics, do check out what they're doing. There's some really cool science. But you've seen the whole spectrum of pharma. So let me start by asking you kind of, how are we doing with digital transformation? How would you score the industry in terms of where we are?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I mean, look, I think there are a lot of bright spots in the industry, for sure, when it comes to a transformational journey. And one example is really, if you take a look at the mRNA technologies, for example, in the pandemic, I'm still at awe that we, as an industry, in particular, you think of Moderna, you think of BioNTech, were able to bring such an innovative therapy for such a pandemic that has impacted every corner of the world within less than a year, with efficacy rates of 96%, 95%. It's unbelievable if you think about it, that those two companies were tiny, tiny companies, and very rapidly, taking different routes, they were able to transform themselves, either through their own journey or by partnering with larger companies, such as what BioNTech did with Pfizer, and really be able to produce billions of doses around the world. So for me, I'm very enthusiastic about our potential to leverage technology and transform. The key to your question is, are we doing it consistently, and are we doing it at scale? I think this is where we have a more of a checkered, scorecard in that perspective. And that doesn't just apply to like a larger company or a small company, because to be honest, in these days, biopharma, it's not really pharma and biotech. I mean, I would argue a biotech like Amgen with $150 billion market cap doesn't really have much to do with my tiny biotech of $130 million market cap. So, you have pre-commercial companies, you have companies that have multiple assets in the marketplace, and so on and so forth. So I think we can do much better. And technologies, advances like the mRNA vaccines have really, reinstilled hope in me that we can actually do this at scale and do this completely.
Yeah, and as you point out, I mean, COVID, for all the challenges, has been a great example of moving really quick and getting science out there at scale. It's what the industry does all the time. You then compare that to maybe digital transformation, and I'm sure you've kind of heard the comment before. I mean, the pharma industry has more pilots than the airline industry. All these pilots going on everywhere, thousands upon thousands. It's not my joke, sorry. But so many of them don't actually have any staying power, and our session title is The Impermanence of Transformation. So what's the problem there? Why have we got so many pilots, and some probably don't want to scale because they're not good, but there are some really good things that never break out of this localized activity? What do we need to do?
Yeah, I definitely appreciate the question. I mean, pilots, I don't know, maybe it's with age or experience, like the more I hear about the word pilot, I have a love-hate relationship with that word now. I used to be very enthusiastic when I hear a pilot. Let's do a pilot. But then, to your point, it's all over the map. You really have to take a look at, what's driving that pilot. The idea that you want to do something on a smaller scale to test, learn from it, and then integrate the learnings into a larger, run at it, that's a very, very good thing to do. And a lot of companies, especially the larger ones, because the larger you get, I mean, it's much more difficult to move an entire organization. So you do want to do, test, learn, retool, and all that. Unfortunately, what I've experienced is a lot of times when we say we want to do a pilot, that might be the driver, but there are other drivers we got to be aware of. For example, I've seen where there is a lot of resistance for doing something, where, the team might think, oh, there's this vendor, somehow they got to the CEO's ear and they convinced him or her about, this is a cool thing, and the person got excited, and now they're like, oh, we want to do a pilot. And the team is looking at it saying, we already have, things to do from morning to evening. Please don't throw something more on us. and then they try to contain the enthusiasm by saying, okay, we will run a pilot for you. And unfortunately, I'm guilty of doing that as well. Because basically what you're saying is, like, okay, let's deal with this 6 months down the line. By that time, we will have some projects that will end, and then we can focus on this. Meanwhile, we will have this guy off our back until that time. So it really is important to kind of take a look at it as to what's driving the pilot, what are the metrics for success, when are we going to actually take another look at it, and make sure that whoever's starting that pilot actually has the staying power to ask us that question, or else it just becomes one of those, it looks pretty on a slide. We have 7 pilots going on in these areas. We're partnering with this X company and with the Y company, and usually they're bigger names. And then it's like, okay, so 2 years later, you look at it, it's like, where is it? And that's kind of where we look. So the whole idea of why pilots are important, it's still, very, very good to do. It's just the drivers, we just have to be realistic that sometimes the drivers are not just the test, learn, and scale, but there are other considerations going on, especially in larger companies.
A couple of thoughts that triggers for me. One is whether we actually think about scalability when we're doing pilots, because even in a small-scale pilot, changing the way people behave is tricky.
Yeah.
Even when something has been successful, if you try and take that to a whole organization, if you haven't thought about scalability until that point, are you already doomed to failure?
Well, you're going to have to backtrack and really take a look at it. So what you're trying to do is trying to do 2 things. One is you don't want to go to everyone, because the whole idea of a pilot is that you're putting it in a much smaller scale so that you are able to run faster to a point where you're able to demonstrate to the company that actually this has legs.
Yeah.
But on the other side, if you have not thought of scalability from the beginning, then it's a much bigger task afterwards to bring in the additional stakeholders and make sure you're enrolling them into their conversation. You're addressing the needs, what's in it for them. Because what's happening with the additional transformations and being faster and faster, people get exhausted. People get exhausted, and if somebody's not keeping their eye on how many pilots and things we're throwing at folks, that becomes a problem from a scalability perspective. And of course, if something works, as they say, success has many fathers and failure is an orphan, right? A lot of people will start, finger pointing. Oh, it's because of that department, or it's because of this department, or whatever. And that leaves a bad taste in folks' minds.
Yeah.
So I think transformation, especially pilots, need to be thought of from a scalability before, but you still want to start small, or else you're not going to get anywhere by starting big.
Yeah, and the other thought you triggered is about this adding things on top. And I'm sure everybody in this room has been in that position where a really cool new project or pilot comes along, and you're like, fantastic, I'll do this between 2 and 4 in the morning, which is the only slot I've got left in my calendar. So do we need to think more as we're doing some of these new things and changing the way we work about not just saying we're doing this, but also we're going to stop doing this to create some space?
Well, that's the tough one, right? I mean, in a way, like my dream is someday to have a conference like this, where we're not only sharing successes, which is very important, but we're actually sharing failures. I mean, imagine we do a conference where all we talk about is all the things that didn't work and the learnings from there. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel again and again. But a lot of times that's just not human nature. We don't get paid on that failure, especially the bigger we get as a company. It really is about how good it looks, how can we move forward. So it takes a lot of courage to actually stop things.
Yeah.
And that's kind of where I love the biotech industry that now I work in, because you actually don't have a ability to continue with some of those zombie projects. You're going to run out of cash. So it's a pretty brutal way of saying, yeah, we tried this, it's not going to work. I wonder in a larger company, would I have done that, where would I have pulled the trigger, And I can tell you there are multiple things that come to mind where I wish I pulled the trigger and stopping a project 6 months, 12 months beforehand,
Yeah.
versus letting it, have a slow death, which is never fun. So these are some of the things we got to take a look at as we go forward, including what are we stopping doing.
So I'm intrigued by how you've seen organizations encourage that information sharing, because, as you say, that's not just on the good side, that's the bad side. And I think about, my work, one of my clients, where they're taking things at a local level, scaling across the organization. There's a huge amount of work involved in disseminating those good pilots. But the things that don't work, people tend to brush those under the carpet, and it's really hard to get those shared. How do we encourage more open sharing of good and bad across organizations?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think there was a question from the audience in the beginning where, even from a partner or a vendor perspective, they walk into a room and there are multiple people around from a company, and depending on their department, let's call it, even that partner will see that this team is not aligned on what is the scope. So actually, one of my things that I've done over the years, like I work with my trusted partners externally over and over and actually seek their insights on our company. Because a lot of times, I don't see it. It doesn't happen in front of me, but it happens in other meetings. So I will ask, I will seek, to say, hey, we want to work with you, and we put all these different people on the team. What did you see from your vantage point? And be careful what you ask. Sometimes they'll tell you, they're like, look, you're not deemed for success because you have a very clear dichotomy or a trichotomy of what success looks like. And I've seen over the years some vendor partners actually push back on the company and say, look, if you guys don't sort your scope, I'm not taking this job. I mean, that's a very courageous thing to do.
Yeah.
They're like going to be leaving money on the table. But I've seen that more and more because, they know things will go wrong and they're going to be, to blame at the end of the day. And then they're tainted. And now their ability to work, with this company is kind of not good. So the whole idea is, what are the metrics? What are we asking people to do? So one of the things I do is, we either are effective, all of us, or we're not effective. So, I always put a picture of that famous boat where there is a hole on one side and you have people on the other side sitting saying, thank God the hole is on the other side of this boat. And that's really a very telling picture to say, look, if it doesn't work, we're all going to pay a price. And if it works, we're all going to be lifted by this project. So the whole idea that it wasn't my department, it was that department, you got to cut that. The whole idea that technically the operation went well, but the patient died. At the end of the day, what's effective is the holistic. So putting 2-3 KPIs that everybody feels the same pain or everybody feels the same gain, in my opinion, when you do that rewarding system, you get people to really either choose to work together, or to be honest, there's another way. If you can't work together, you're going to have to get out of the boat.
Yeah.
That's one thing where sometimes having those conversations early on is not a bad thing. You don't want folks who will be there and just resistant to that new way of doing business.
Yeah, and I guess that's not just vendors. I mean, vendors, you're paying their bills. Their instinct will be to say, it's great, it's going to be fantastic. Yes. Employees, the same thing applies to. People don't necessarily like to speak up and say, what about this, what about that, that really sucks. Encouraging that dialogue is probably pretty important in all of that.
Well, I mean, a lot of what we're talking about over here, is it technology or is it culture, is it people? It's actually all of the above. It's not, I mean, technology, I'm always in awe when I hear, and that's one of the reasons I come to these meetings is I want to get educated more and more into what is the latest and greatest on the technology side. But let's face it, technology is moving at a much faster pace than we are as people. Yeah. The resistance to change that we have, because it's a defensive mechanism. That's what made us, get here, is because we always understand risk. For some people, when you say change or transform, it's a positive thing. I can tell you for a lot of people, it's not a positive, because it's the fear of the unknown, it's the change, and that's where any change, any transformation has to address the needs of the employees at every different levels. That has to be very, very clear of why we're doing what we're doing and what's in it for you. And if that's not addressed, which unfortunately, we see a lot of big transformations happening, And then that gets kind of addressed very superficially. And then people are surprised when, some of the best talents leave. And they're like, what happened? So it's really important that we address the needs of internal folks, even more than our customers first. Because, the same way when you're in a plane, they tell you when there is a drop in air pressure, you got to put your oxygen mask on yourself first before you try to help others. In a way, that applies to our employees. We got to make sure that we're putting that oxygen mask on our employees first before we try to help others. That's for me has been always one of the key things where transformations either succeed or fail because of those rewarding systems.
Yeah. We're sort of heading into the last few minutes here, and I want to ask you kind of what you're really excited about as you look at transformation and transformation at scale, either now or in the future. As you're answering that, if there are questions from the audience, stick your hand up. I'll try and squeeze one or two questions in. But what are you excited about as you look at the next 2 or 3 years?
Look, the era of, there are 2 areas which are really, really emerging as very important needs, healthcare and education. Those are very important. Even in the pandemic times, we've seen an explosion of need, and that, in my opinion, will continue. So we're blessed to be in an environment where we're working on very, very important topics for people. But at the same time, that burning platform of transformation is there. So if you're in a healthcare business, be it in a pharma or be it in a biotech, that burning platform is really there. Because, it used to be, the model used to be before, okay, in Europe, prices get squished. Well, we increase the prices in the US and we move on. But, over last year, with the new Inflation Reduction Act, for example, that's really getting people to pause and say, okay, how do we make sure that we're rethinking our models so that healthcare is accessible for all? So I'm very excited about that possibility of how we're going to, rethink our models. We got pushed into it, but we're going to have to rethink it. The need is always going to be there, and the future is really in our hands. The worst thing we can do is just kind of hope that we close our eyes and this goes away.
Yeah.
It's not going to go away.
Yeah.
So it's really going to be up to us to really stand, be courageous, take the decisions that are needed. And sometimes if it's not the popular ones as well, it's part of change.
Yeah, which is a key thing in big companies in particular. Being popular is not always the right thing to do. Are there any questions while we're in the last few minutes here? Yeah, there's a question here. Have we got a microphone? Just coming to you now.
Thank you. Thank you for your session. My name is Nikolai Shein. I'm from Customer Times. My question is, thank you for presentation, and I would like to hear maybe a good example of good and bad. Yeah, so what's transformation you can think of, I don't know, over last year lead to success and why, and what's the brightest failure of the year, and again, why? Thank you.
Yeah, I think, on the positive side, as I was saying, before, for me, Moderna and BioNTech are just unbelievable examples of how, they were able to transform themselves in such a, fast way. Many people, remember Moderna, that it was this small company that for many, many years, in fact, almost for 10 years, was investing in this platform and not getting credit for it over and over and over. And now that's kind of forgotten. And I wonder how many Modernas are there where for many, many years they invested that kind of money and it just never went anywhere. So this is a great example for me of how when you have that investment in the science, there is a time where you can actually leverage it and really solve very, very meaningful issues such as what we had through the pandemic times. It's more difficult to give negative examples, to be honest. I have to say, maybe we can chat during the coffee break about that. But we see it. I can't say it's one company or the other. I can tell you in every company I've worked in, there was at least one project that, in my mind, was just not either the reason why we started it was not the right one, or we didn't stop it at the right time, or it morphed into like a group project where suddenly you look at it, you're like, okay, we were trying to solve this problem. Now everybody else got involved. Now it's trying to do too many things. That's one of the biggest things I've seen is a project scope creep, where you start wanting to, target something, and then it just becomes I don't want to say a democratic process. It just becomes, oh, but we wanted to do this as well. We wanted to do this. We wanted to do that. And then we hire a vendor, and then it doesn't work. And then, of course, we blame the vendor. Oh, they couldn't, and that's, to be honest, I mean, that's one thing I would change is really making sure that we're having that, scope very, very well thought of from the beginning. Take double the time from the start, make sure that that's locked, and then we always keep ourselves updated versus what are we trying to do. So we don't have this, project creep happening, and then we kind of say, oh, it didn't work. So that's one area I can.
Prioritization and clear scope. I know we're out of time, and I know Dario runs a very tight ship, so we will need to wrap it up. But Harout will be here, I think, through the whole event if you want to speak to him. Thank you very much. Always good to catch up.
Thank you, Paul. Appreciate it.